Are you ready?
Been carved out the pumpkin because I know from slavery, my ancestors were slaves. So I know what the pumpkin stands for when they used to hang us and put the pumpkin on.
Who lied to you? I'm literally floored right now. That's what the pumpkin stands for? Listen, you guys, when you hear stuff like this, you gotta call it out. I can't believe this. Either he's just saying this to say it, or he genuinely believes this. And in that case, I'm going to correct it. In all seriousness, sir, have you read a history book? Have you studied any other culture outside of your own? I don't know why everybody is so hell-bent on erasing every other culture and saying that things, instead of dating back to, I don't know, maybe the Irish and Scottish and Gaelic folks, is now not true and originates from slavery. And I'm sure that most people on this app have already said or corrected this man in saying that it comes from the Irish folks and taking turnips and carving them out and putting coals and lighting them up to scare away demons and ghosts, right? However, I'm going to go a step further because I actually like this stuff. I actually like history. In Celtic enclaves of Northern Europe, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, the carvings of human faces into round fruits and vegetables have been going on for thousands of years. It is a tradition that likely evolved from the Celtic custom of head veneration. You know, cutting your enemy's head off and keeping it and showing it off as a trophy. The Celtics actually had an obsession with heads. You can literally go back in history and find it for yourself. Not only did Celtic warriors take the severed heads of their enemies and hang them around their horses' necks, but if you were a very important enemy, your head was actually embalmed in cedar oil and put out on display. This practice is also shown in the ancient Irish tradition of creating brain balls, where the brains of the enemies were hardened with lime and used as slingshot projectiles. Thousands of years ago, they were doing this. It's nothing new. It's nothing recent, in fact. And it certainly didn't originate in the Americas. Now, all that other stuff aside, a lot of people will tell you that the reason we carve jack-o'-lanterns is actually because of an 18th century Irish folktale about Stingy Jack. Now, Stingy Jack dies, and the devil, keeping true to his word, refuses to let him into hell. And God refuses to let him into heaven. So what is to be his fate? To wander forever in eternal darkness, right? But the devil isn't completely heartless. So he tosses him a clump of hell coal. And in turn, Jack carves out a turnip and puts it in there to light his way, so he can wander the earth for all eternity. Hence, he creates a lantern, or a jack-o'-lantern. So, case closed. That's why we do jack-o'-lanterns, right? To celebrate Stingy Jack. Another version claims that it's not to celebrate him, but to protect oneself from him. That's why people were carving grotesque faces into turnips and putting them on their steps out in front of their doors, to protect them from evil roaming spirits like Jack. But the truth is, the story of Stingy Jack was not invented to explain the carved turnip or vegetable lanterns. Instead, it was invented to explain a whole different phenomenon altogether. Ignis fatuus. And in modern Greek, it literally means foolish fire. Now, you might wonder, what exactly does that mean? It's referring to the eerie, but completely natural flickering of lights over bogs and marshlands. Now, these lights were caused by the combustion of gases that came from decomposing matter. And so the story of Stingy Jack was often given as an explanation for the ignis fatuus that they would see over the peat bogs. Now, these lights were also known as will-o'-the-wisp, which you can see right behind me, or fairy lights, or fool's fire. Now, if you were to follow these lights, you could go into a sinkhole or a bog and drown. And thus people thought they were evil spirits or ghosts, or Stingy Jack, Jack-o'-the-lantern. There was one thing I left out. And this one thing is the Celtic celebration of Samhain. And in my opinion, this is probably one of the most popular and well-known origins of carving out turnips, or the jack-o'-lantern, if you will. Now, Samhain was first observed by the Celtic pagans. It marked the new year, the end of the summer, and the end of the harvest season, and it signaled the beginning of winter. On this day, the Celts believed that the veil between the living and the dead was exceptionally thin. And since they had a ton of rooted vegetables from the harvest, ancient peoples would carve frightening faces in them to scare off restless spirits. Now, there's also a fire element to the festival of Samhain. On the night of October 31st, all fires burning in Ireland and other Celtic countries were to be extinguished and could only be rekindled by the ceremonial practice of lighting the fires by the Druids. And to make this practice easier, a great deal of lanterns were needed to transport the burning coals to light the fires, and thus those carved out turnips or vegetables served a practical purpose besides a symbolic one. Now let's fast forward to a whole nother time, the 17th century. Here you will find a whole nother meaning or origin for the term jack-o'-lantern. And let me give you a hint, it has nothing to do with ghosts, devils, or spirits at all. It's a little thing called night watchman. In 17th century Britain, Jack was a common catchphrase for someone whose name you didn't know, sort of like John Doe. So an anonymous night watchman might be called a jack-o'-the-lantern or jack-o'-lantern. Now on to the Americanization of the jack-o'-lantern, from turnips to pumpkins. In the decades that followed the Great Famine, millions of Irish immigrants fled to the Americas, and with them they brought their ancient Samhain traditions of carving turnips with them. And even though they were more used to carving out turnips or rooted vegetables, they soon found that pumpkins were much more easier to use. Now, the first mention of a pumpkin jack-o'-lantern appears in Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1835 short story, The Great Carbuncle, in which a band of adventurers seek out a legendary gem. And to quote Hawthorne, "Hide it under thy cloak, sayest thou? Why, it will gleam through the holes and make thee look like a jack-o'-lantern." Given that The Great Carbuncle was written before the massive influx of Irish immigrants to North America, it is possible that Hawthorne is not actually referencing a pumpkin jack-o'-lantern in this passage, but the phenomena of ignis fatuus, which we talked about earlier. According to the Irish Times, the first definitive reference to a pumpkin jack-o'-lantern carved in celebration of Halloween occurred in 1886, when a Canadian newspaper, the Daily News, reported the following: "The old-time custom of keeping up Halloween was not forgotten last night by the youngsters of the city. There was a great sacrifice of pumpkins from which to make transparent heads and face, lighted up by the unfailing 2 inches of tallow candle." However, it should be noted that the first image of a pumpkin jack-o'-lantern appeared nearly 2 decades before this in the November 23rd, 1867 issue of Harper's Weekly. It was published alongside an article titled A Pumpkin Effigy, but, and this is an important but, the article did not refer to the carved gourd as a jack-o'-lantern, nor did it reference Halloween. Now, with all that being said, the Irish origins of the jack-o'-lantern is widely accepted and held by scholars and historians. And as you can see, it has nothing to do with slavery at all.